It is a common yet chronically online take that some people believe that their once favorite video game, anime, or otherwise series is or has become too woke, DEI, and or political. I mean, it's so horrible that some players just have to go through the task of playing as a woman or a person of color, or God forbid both. Add on to the fact that some people feel that showing diversity and talking about issues regarding inequality is somehow being forced down your throat as some brand new concept. That gaming, and by extension art in general, has become too political. But hot take, perhaps the hottest take of the century. Art is political, and will always be political, as that was the case for most of human history. And in a lot of cases, that's actually a good thing, and let me explain why. I'm Ayasuna, and I make videos, more specifically art videos, but I wasn't actually planning on making this a video, at least not yet, but in light of recent decisions, I think the issue of art and overall media literacy is more important than ever. And it will be even more so over these next few years. We are going to have to lean into community to get through times of censorship and erasure of certain identities, whether that's race or country of origin, or even who you choose to spend your life with. And one of the ways to do that is with art. Now, in the case of this video, I'm using art as an umbrella term. This also includes writing, acting, and other forms of storytelling, but since I'm the most familiar with art, I'm just going to refer to it as that. Art has often been used as a form of social commentary, and it goes far beyond the existence of Twitter or even the internet in general. In fact, it's one of the reasons why art history is even a thing to begin with. We can place these different creations in the context of which that they were made, whether that's something exaggerated or grand like becoming royalty or ascending to godhood, or something more philosophical like the representation of death. Art can even be political in the sense that it shows how we see ourselves and the world around us, whether that's some self-profound yet emotional self-portrait, or some silly meme in a newspaper. By and large, artists are quite observant people. It is because of that curse/blessing of being observant is why, in the context of storytelling, artists often have a lot to say about society, whether that's an expression or critique on society, politics, and the overall environment. Artists have used their craft for social commentary for many centuries, whether that's expressing political beliefs, criticizing poverty and war, mocking royalty or government, and showing people how they live their everyday lives and raise awareness to social issues. I repeat, art has always been political, and it's pretty much foolish to think otherwise, no matter what your average rage baiter on Twitter thinks. Now, I'm not saying that you have to agree with every single artist's point of view, especially in the case of racism, sexism, and other forms of bigotry. Art has been used to push harmful stereotypes about groups of people. Minstrel shows are one of those examples. It's also been used to justify atrocities. The rise of fascist beliefs and Nazism in general is an attest to this, both in the earliest 20th century and now. And on the flip side, I get it, nobody likes being preached to. I think the issue that a lot of games and shows and overall series have these days when it comes to quote-unquote DEI is mainly just an issue of bad writing. But that's not necessarily the fault of the characters, it's usually the game developer or the gaming studio itself that causes these issues. It wouldn't exactly be the first time that a social movement was co-opted by a corporation. They aren't saying these statements because they generally care about the communities that they're trying to pander to. They're simply doing it for money. The many problems with the gaming industry is not because they chose to hire women or people of color, it is simply because they're being greedy. If anything, I think the problem is the opposite. Artists aren't given the freedom to do the crafts that they like because they have to adhere to a guideline in order to get profits. And I'm sorry, I kinda have to go on a side tangent here. I'm tired of people constantly saying DEI hire anytime a woman or a person of color gets into a leadership/work position. Just because someone comes from a different background, whether that's a gender background or a racial background, it doesn't mean that they're inferior to you or your skills as a worker. It's not exactly rocket science to string together code if you understand a particular programming language. And I think the irony here about people who say stuff like this is that they constantly bring up the race card or the gender card, but there's some of the biggest people who have the hugest victim complex. They want to blame anything and anyone for why they didn't get a particular position. Perhaps you want to look inward and practice on your craft, as well as how you deal with other people coming from a different background before you can complain. But that's just a theory. A game theory. And if you made it this long in this 20 to 30 minute rant session, you can drop a like as well as subscribe, as that would help a long way with growing my channel. I want my channel to be a place where we can discuss topics such as art education, art history, media literacy, and representation in media. But I also like being a little silly, and I also play games, so if you're interested in that, then don't hesitate to check out my Twitch, twitch.tv/iasuna19, and I also made a Discord where we can talk about topics such as these down below, which I'll have pinned in my description, as well as the top comment most likely. Enough shilling aside, back to the main topic of this video. When people say they don't want politics shoved into their favorite games or shows, it can be hard to understand what they mean when they say stuff like that. A lot of the popular series of all time tend to deal with political themes and stories. For instance, the movie/book Jurassic Park deals with how ethical it is for humans to actually raise wild animals in captivity. While obviously the T-Rex doesn't exist anymore, at least in the way that we think of it, it raises good questions about the limitations of science and how ethical zoology as a practice is. People have said that Star Wars is too woke, even though the creator himself drew parallels between the Empire to various leaders like Julius Caesar, Napoleon, and even Hitler. The whole theme of the series is how authoritarian governments rise in the perspective of multiple different characters. It probably isn't a stretch that a guy that wrote about an evil empire isn't exactly a fan of imperialism. Even kids shows like Avatar: The Last Airbender tackled themes such as genocide and the effect of a 100-year-long war. Through the perspective of a kid, by the way. The show does an awesome job with representation as well as showing the true realities about war to children and in an appropriate setting. The show still also has good representation when it comes to disabled characters and other themes that other shows just don't tackle these days. Both Goku and Superman, Kakarot and Kal-El respectively, are both aliens who have to learn how to live on Earth and still protect the ones that they love. DC Comics in general tend to talk about the issues of inequality, addiction, as well as mental health. There are countless other examples that I could name here that give the same effect, talking about social issues in context to society. When an artist makes a story of their own, they're likely going to be influenced by the stuff that they see in their real life. It's pretty common for an artist or an author's opinion to creep inside a book. Now, whether that's right or wrong, that definitely depends on the reader and the context in which that happens. Even if you aren't particularly in the creative field, it can be harmful to have these reductionist views about certain shows just because they have something that you may or may not like. I'm saying show in general, but it really applies to any piece of literature, whether that's a game or a book or a series, really anything. Having political themes in shows isn't inherently good or inherently bad. What I do think is harmful, though, is the fact that people just don't want to be challenged in their beliefs. And I get that bad writing is definitely an issue for a lot of series. But many people won't give a game or a new show or series or whatever a chance because they think it's going to be woke, and it could actually be something that has a lot of potential. I said it once and I'll say it again. People complain about the gaming industry, but they don't really want to try independent games, so how can they expect EA and all these expensive game devs to change their games? If you're gonna whine about it on Twitter or YouTube for that matter, and still play the game, then they kind of won and they don't really have to listen to your input. In the same breath, even if the game is something that you just simply don't enjoy, that doesn't give you the right to shit on anyone else who does. If you don't like something, just say you don't like it and then move on. But constantly calling it woke 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 doesn't really change anything either. No one group should serve as a monolith for a whole culture or race or whatever subdivision. Diversity can be a good tool, literary speaking and artistically speaking, if handled properly. But because corporations are so interested in making a quick buck, that's becoming rarer these days. And like I said, I don't necessarily think that that's a problem because of who these companies decide to hire. I think it's more or less the turnaround time and the lack of creative freedom that allows these things to happen. It's the most noticeable in the gaming industry, and it's one of the biggest forms of entertainment these days. But this is also quite common in the whole animation field as well as other outlets. I think the creative field loses itself when it becomes centered around money and competition, as we see with all these larger corporations. If these companies like Disney and EA, among others, don't feel like the audience can sit down and actually properly enjoy a story with their games, it's no wonder that these games come out feeling rushed and have characters that definitely feel like they've been forced. But like I said, this doesn't just apply to gaming, it applies to shows and other forms of media these days. I'd argue the problem isn't because these shows are too quote-unquote political or woke. I think the problem is actually the opposite. For artists and a lot of younger creators who want to get into these companies, they may feel like they need to draw a certain way or censor themselves a certain way with their artwork. And as such, we get a lot of products that feel almost identical to one another. Nothing stands out in a field that totally feels like everything is the same. To get a job, artists probably feel like they can't critique society or certain aspects of society as well as they might have 100 or so years ago. I actually think Disney is the prime example of what I'm talking about here. Whether it's classical Disney, Marvel Universe, or even now Star Wars, there's a real complaint among fans that everything they see or most of the live series that comes out these days feels stale, unoriginal, and quote-unquote woke. While I definitely think that Disney is one of the main contributors of social movements being co-opted by these larger companies, I think the real reason why Disney has lost its charm in these past few years is because that they're trying to play it safe. They aren't being creative anymore. They figure it's easy to do reboots of cartoons or movies in live action that nobody asks for, as opposed to trying something new. Coming up with a new Disney princess that might actually captivate audiences, and coming up with live action series that don't retcon previously established characters. It isn't so much that adding a diverse cast is what ruins a show, but not giving the writers actual creative freedom to work in the way that they see fit is the main issue here. And that seems consistent among all these corporations that make these series, games, or other forms of media. I think Nickelodeon is yet another example of this. In the 2000s, Avatar was probably one of the most notorious shows on Nick. In the 2010s, it was Legend of Korra. But now, what exactly is the show for the 2020s for Nickelodeon? Nick is more focused on having reboots of older shows and having the 3 billionth season of SpongeBob air, as opposed to trying new series and exploring new ideas that both children and adults can actually enjoy, and doesn't feel like it's insulting their intelligence. It seems like everyone is going reboot crazy these days, and it ends up having a stale, sobering effect on series that were once beloved by many fans. And I think that is the discontent that many people face, and not necessarily because these shows have gone woke. Artists aren't allowed to be able to create their own series if they don't have the necessary backing to create such series. And as a result, a lot of ideas and stories don't get told, which could actually prove to be really successful, but they never see the light of day because they don't align to company standards. Creativity isn't something that can be taught, nor is it something that can be bought for billions of dollars. Shows and games like Avatar prove that you can talk about darker themes in a way that is thoughtful both on the people who it affects, as well as show a diverse cast of characters, seeing how they live amongst the circumstances. Getting along with different groups of people really shouldn't be seen as political, but that's just not the reality we live in. Artists and creators in general shouldn't feel afraid to tackle these larger issues without having to face backlash. We as a society shouldn't be mindlessly consuming our things without even thinking about the context in which they were made. I'm not saying that you have to analyze every single brushstroke of your favorite artist or creator or series, but understanding the context and seeing the themes in the shows that we watch helps a long way. With the advent of the internet, pop culture has its relevancy as far as being a part of our history, and understanding that can actually go a long way for future generations. I mentioned this in a previous video, but the whole anti-intellectual trend is really troubling, as it can stymie both artists and other creators from making things that they truly want out of fear of not being accepted or risking getting that dream job of theirs. If artists feel like they have to hide their voices to conform to society, then stories don't get told and history may or may not be lost. If people just mindlessly consume these series and games without giving that a second thought, it's no wonder that these game devs and other corporations feel like they can just get lazy on the overall story of a game. These issues with games and shows and other forms of art will continue so long as our own media literacy continues to drop. Good art, whether it's in the form of a game, show, or other type of media, can and should challenge the audience to think differently. I can't grow as a person or as an artist if I don't consume things that I may or may not necessarily agree with. I think the problem with media isn't that it's quote-unquote too woke. I think the issue isn't necessarily who the company decides to hire to do these series and projects. I truly think the problem is that the audience or overall general public feels like they can't or don't want to challenge themselves. And a huge part of that is with social media, as we tend to tailor our content to fit our own echo chamber. It's so easy to fall into that rabbit hole of content that aligns to our beliefs and values, that when we find something that doesn't align with our stances or makes us think about our current prejudices, it can be hard to deal with. It's easy to cast what we don't believe to be true as some sort of other, or it must be false because I just don't believe it. Trust me, I know how that feels because I was there when I was younger. We already know that these companies are trying to divide us and feed to our emotions, making the situation worse. So, believe it or not, the issue behind all of this, whether it's the art commentary part or the part of us just not agreeing on anything anymore, it really does come down to corporate greed and how these corporations just don't have consequences. I mean, these issues of lowered attention spans, lower media literacy, and all around division, it didn't just come out of nowhere. Obviously, division was always a thing, but like I said, those other two issues that I mentioned definitely came about with the advent of social media. And it's pretty hypocritical because I'm using a social media platform to talk about this, but I figured that this is the best audience that I can get my message out to. Bottom line, if we want to combat this alarming rise of anti-intellectualism and subsequent fascism, we need to understand and teach media literacy. Art is one of the more effective ways to do that, but it can be hard to do that in a 30-second or so video. Media literacy is especially important in places where disinformation runs rampant and there's little to no fact-checking. You can't always believe what you hear, and you definitely need to question everything that you see online, but not just online, even in your daily life. For a large chunk of human history, art was one way to teach media literacy. And it proved to be quite successful, as many artists over the centuries did go over certain themes, whether it's talking about corruption, racism against certain ethnicities, or other messaging. But with art being made to feel more corporate these days, those messages get lost in a lot of series. People are being taught to consume more and more without even thinking about what they're watching or how it impacts others around them. And I feel like that's the most evident in children's shows these days, like I mentioned earlier. In the 2000s and early 2010s, we had shows that talked about mature themes in a way that was both palatable for kids as well as mature enough for adults to enjoy. But now, a lot of children's shows are either soulless reboots or series that have gone on for way too long. A lot of children's content feels overstimulating, and that's coming from an adult in their mid-20s. I can't imagine how that's like for a little kid. They're more concerned with flashy colors and music as opposed to teaching kids a lesson about working together or coming up with ideas for the common good. Can we really be surprised about the state of current Gen Alpha and other younger generations if they aren't exactly being shown or encouraged to be creative? They're only shown to consume things and not really think about where things come from. And if this continues, I really do worry about art in general as well as society. If there's something you would like to add to this conversation, then please let me know down in the comments. Again, I didn't really plan for this to be a video just yet, although I did want to talk about this issue. So apologies if some parts feel a bit rambly or tangenty. Also, if you noticed that throughout this entire video I sound a bit different, it's because I got another microphone. So hopefully my sound quality won't be as yikes as it was before. But I think if we're going to get through these next few years, it's important to talk about things and not take them at face value. Especially with the media that we consume in our everyday life. We want to think of these things as escapism, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Art, in general, is supposed to challenge our beliefs on certain topics. And if we get away from that, I think that means nothing but trouble for society as a whole. Regardless or if you're an artist or not, or just someone who's interested in that type of content. But that's just my opinion. That's pretty much everything I want to say for this video, so if you enjoyed what you see here, don't hesitate to like and subscribe. I tend to want to upload once a week, although for this video I ran a little bit behind. So until the next video or live stream, goodbye and take care. Peace. Also, don't let anyone stop you from creating. Art is going to be more important than ever, so it's better to express your ideas in an era where self-expression is seriously going down the drain. I want my channel to be a place for self-expression, but I also want to see yours, so please don't hesitate to share that down below. I'd be interested in checking out your work. Okay, now I can say goodbye. Peace.